My name is Claudia Johnson, and until 3 weeks ago, I was a senior data analyst at Westside Tech. I'd been there for 4 years, working my way up from junior analyst to someone the team actually relied on. I knew every dataset, every quirk in our systems, every potential red flag that could spell disaster for our quarterly reports. Or at least, I thought I did. I remember my first day at Westside Tech like it was yesterday. Fresh out of college with a computer science degree and stars in my eyes, I was assigned to a cramped cubicle in the corner of the analytics floor. The coffee was terrible, the air conditioning was broken more often than it worked, and I loved every minute of it. I was finally doing real work, solving real problems, making a difference in a growing company. Those early days were a whirlwind of learning and discovery. I remember my first mentor, Elena Rodriguez, showing me the ropes with infinite patience. She taught me that data wasn't just numbers on a screen, it was stories waiting to be told, patterns that could transform entire business strategies. Elena left for a startup in Silicon Valley after my first year, but her lesson stayed with me. I worked my way up methodically. Junior analyst became analyst, analyst became senior analyst. Each promotion felt earned, each new responsibility a validation of my growing expertise. I specialized in complex data integrations, the kind of work that made other analysts groan but made me feel alive. There's something beautiful about taking chaotic, scattered information and transforming it into clean, actionable insights. My cubicle evolved too. What started as a sterile workspace became a command center filled with multiple monitors, sticky notes with cryptic reminders, and a small succulent plant that somehow survived despite the office's lighting. My colleagues would joke that I spoke to my computer more than to humans, and honestly, they weren't wrong. Code was logical, predictable, fair, everything that office politics wasn't. Harrison Blake joined the team about 18 months ago as our new team lead. He came from a larger tech company with impressive credentials and a confident handshake that made executives nod approvingly. But from day one, something felt off about him. He had this way of taking credit for collaborative work, of positioning himself as the genius behind solutions that had emerged from team brainstorming sessions. I watched him systematically undermine my previous team lead, Janet Kim, with a campaign of subtle sabotage. He'd question her decisions in meetings, CC upper management on emails highlighting problems that could have been solved with a simple conversation, and gradually position himself as the voice of reason solving crises he'd helped create. When Janet finally left for another company, Harrison's promotion felt inevitable rather than earned. Under his leadership, our team dynamic shifted. Where Janet had encouraged collaboration and shared credit, Harrison created an environment of competition and paranoia. He played favorites, withheld information, and made decisions in isolation that affected everyone. The Morrison project became his obsession, his chance to prove his worth to the C-suite. "Claudia, we need to talk about your system access," he said, gesturing toward the conference room. I followed him, my coffee growing cold as dread settled in my stomach. The walk felt endless, past the motivational posters about teamwork and innovation that suddenly seemed like cruel jokes. Inside the sterile glass box we called Conference Room B, Harrison shuffled through some papers before looking up at me with what I can only describe as practiced sympathy. "Look, this isn't personal," he began, which is exactly what people say when it's about to get very personal. "Upper management is implementing new security protocols. We're limiting data access to only essential personnel for the Morrison project." When I first started working on Morrison's account, it was a mess. Their previous vendor had left behind a patchwork of incompatible systems, database tables that didn't talk to each other, and reporting workflows that required manual intervention at every step. It was exactly the kind of challenge I lived for. I spent months untangling their data architecture, building custom APIs to bridge legacy systems, and creating monitoring dashboards that could predict problems before they became disasters. I worked 60-hour weeks, not because I had to, but because I was genuinely excited about the solutions I was creating. The breakthrough came when I developed a real-time anomaly detection system that could identify data inconsistencies as they happened, rather than days or weeks later during routine audits. Morrison's quarterly reporting time went from 2 weeks to 3 days. Their compliance team went from stressed firefighters to confident strategists. Mitchell Morrison himself called me personally to thank me for the work. That phone call was one of the proudest moments of my career. Here was a successful CEO taking time from his schedule to acknowledge my contribution. He didn't just thank me, he understood the technical complexity of what I'd built and appreciated the business impact it created. That's when I knew I'd found my calling. It started on a Tuesday morning. I was reviewing the monthly performance metrics when Harrison Blake appeared at my desk with that uncomfortable expression managers get when they're about to deliver bad news they don't want to explain. You know the look, tight lips, avoiding eye contact, that slight head tilt that screams I'm about to ruin your day. Essential personnel? I repeated, feeling my professional composure start to crack. Harrison, I created half of those monitoring systems. I know Morrison's data better than anyone except maybe Thomas. He shifted uncomfortably, his chair creaking in the silence. I understand your frustration, but the decision's been made. Thomas and Amy will handle Morrison moving forward. You'll focus on the smaller accounts, plenty of important work there. The dismissal stung, but I've learned that fighting these battles in the moment rarely works. So I nodded, gathered what dignity I could, and returned to my desk to find my access credentials had already been revoked. The speed of it felt deliberate, almost cruel. My computer screen showed those cold, impersonal error messages that IT departments use to make rejection feel systematic rather than personal. That first week was strange. I'd catch myself instinctively checking Morrison's dashboards, only to be met with access denied screens. My colleagues would discuss Morrison updates in hushed tones, conversations that stopped when I approached. It felt like being ghosted by my own job. The office dynamic had shifted subtly but unmistakably. I was now on the outside looking in. But I adapted. I threw myself into the smaller accounts, optimizing their systems and finding efficiencies that had been overlooked. I told myself this was temporary, that I'd prove my value and earn my way back to the important projects. I worked late, came in early, and made sure every smaller client got the premium treatment Morrison used to receive. During that week, I noticed Amy spending more time at Thomas's desk, their heads bent over printouts I couldn't see. They'd glance up when I walked by, offering those strained smiles that said, "We're talking about something you can't know about." The exclusion was systematic and thorough. I tried to focus on my new assignments, but my mind kept drifting to Morrison's data. I'd built in several automated checks and balances, but they required regular monitoring to catch edge cases. The anomaly detection system was particularly sensitive. It learned from patterns over time, but it also needed human oversight to distinguish between real problems and false positives. On Friday of that week, I made a decision that would later seem prophetic. I documented everything I could remember about Morrison's systems, not the code itself, which I no longer had access to, but the behavioral patterns I'd observed, the common failure points, the seasonal variations in their data that could trigger false alarms. I saved this document to my personal drive, telling myself it was just good professional practice. Thomas stopped by my desk that afternoon, looking uncomfortable. "Hey, Claudia," he said, glancing around nervously. "I wanted to ask you about the Morrison quarterly validation process. The documentation is, well, it's not as detailed as I'd hoped." I looked up from my screen, where I'd been debugging a much simpler system for one of our smaller clients. "What specifically are you looking for?" "The anomaly detection thresholds. How do you distinguish between seasonal variations and actual data corruption?" It was a great question, and exactly the kind of nuanced issue that couldn't be learned from documentation alone. I'd spent months calibrating those thresholds, adjusting them based on Morrison's business cycles, learning to recognize the difference between Christmas shopping spikes and system errors. "It's not really about the thresholds themselves," I explained, pulling up a whiteboard. "It's about understanding Morrison's business patterns. See, in Q4, their transaction volumes spike by about 300%, but the spike follows a predictable curve. If you see a sudden jump that doesn't match the historical pattern, that's when you investigate." Thomas nodded, taking notes. "And what about the validation sequence?" "The documentation mentions a 3-step process, but it doesn't explain why the steps have to be in that order," I finished. "The first step calibrates the baseline, the second identifies outliers, and the third cross-references with external data sources. If you skip step 2 or do it out of order, you'll get false positives." We spent an hour going through the intricacies of the system I'd built. Thomas was smart and asked good questions, but I could see the overwhelming complexity settling on his shoulders. This wasn't his fault. He was being asked to maintain a system he hadn't designed, with business context he'd never had the opportunity to develop. "Claudia," he said finally, "I really appreciate this. I know the transition wasn't ideal." "It's not about ideal," I replied. "It's about making sure Morrison's data stays clean." That's bigger than office politics. But even as I said it, I wondered if I was being naive. Maybe office politics and data quality weren't as separate as I wanted to believe. Then came the following Tuesday. I was deep in code, debugging a particularly stubborn query that had been giving me trouble for hours. The office was quiet except for the gentle hum of servers and the occasional keyboard click. I had my noise-canceling headphones on, completely absorbed in the logical puzzle before me, when my office door exploded open. The sound was so violent it made me jump, knocking over my water bottle and sending papers flying. Water spread across my desk, soaking through the quarterly reports I'd been reviewing. Harrison stood in my doorway, his face flushed red, veins visible in his neck. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and there were sweat stains under his arms despite the office air conditioning. Behind him, I could see curious faces peering from their cubicles, drawn by the commotion like moths to a flame. "Why didn't you flag this error?" he shouted, his voice carrying across the entire floor. The words echoed off the glass walls and low cubicle partitions, ensuring that everyone in the office could hear my public humiliation. I stared at him, genuinely confused. My mind raced through possibilities. Had I missed something in the smaller accounts? Made an error in one of the systems I still had access to? What error? The Morrison data corruption. His voice cracked slightly on the word corruption, as if he was struggling to maintain his anger. The entire quarterly report is compromised. 3 days of work down the drain because you didn't catch a validation error that should have been obvious. The irony hit me like a physical blow. I actually felt dizzy for a moment, the unfairness of it so complete that my brain struggled to process it. "Harrison, I don't have access to Morrison's data. You revoked my credentials last week, remember?" His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, then something that looked almost like panic. I could see the exact moment when he remembered our conversation in conference room B, when he realized the logical flaw in his accusation. Around us, the office had gone completely silent. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to pause. That's not the point," he stammered, his voice noticeably quieter now. He was backpedaling, but he'd already committed to this confrontation in front of the entire team. "You should have anticipated this kind of issue. You should have warned us about potential problems before your access was removed." The absurdity of his statement hung in the air like toxic smoke. I was supposed to predict problems in data I couldn't see, in systems I'd been locked out of, for a project I'd been explicitly told was no longer my responsibility. It was like being blamed for not preventing a car accident while blindfolded and locked in a different building. I felt something snap inside me. For years of playing by the rules, of accepting decisions I disagreed with, of being the team player who never rocked the boat. All of it crystallized into this moment of absolute clarity. "You're right," I said, standing up slowly. My voice was calm, but I could feel the tremor of controlled fury underneath. I should have anticipated that removing the person who built the monitoring systems might leave some blind spots. I should have predicted that you'd blame me for not catching errors in data I'm not allowed to see. The words came out with surgical precision, each one calculated to expose the absurdity of his position. I could see people leaning forward in their cubicles, some pretending to work while obviously listening, others openly watching like this was the most interesting thing that had happened in the office all year. Harrison's eyes darted around the office, suddenly aware of our audience. The flush in his face deepened, but now it looked more like embarrassment than anger. "Claudia, let's discuss this privately." "No." The word came out stronger than I'd intended, and I decided to lean into it. "I think our colleagues should hear this. They should know that when something goes wrong with Morrison's data, I'll be the scapegoat, whether I have access or not." I gestured toward Thomas and Amy, who were both frozen at their desks like deer in headlights. They should know that Thomas and Amy inherited a system they didn't build, with documentation they didn't write, and business context they weren't given time to develop. And when that system inevitably fails because institutional knowledge was treated as disposable, it will somehow still be my fault. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. I could see Thomas and Amy at their desks, both staring at their screens but obviously listening. Amy looked particularly uncomfortable, and I suddenly understood why. "This was planned, wasn't it?" I said, the pieces falling into place with crystalline clarity. "You needed someone to blame when Morrison's system failed. So you removed my access, waited for the inevitable problem, then made sure everyone knew it was my fault." Harrison's silence was answer enough. But I wasn't done. Tell me, Harrison, what specific error are we talking about? What validation check failed? What data got corrupted? I crossed my arms and waited. He opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly struggling. The quarterly aggregation process. There was a mismatch between the source data and the final reports. What kind of mismatch? Revenue figures. They were inconsistent. I nodded slowly. Ah. And did this happen during the end of quarter processing, when transaction volumes spike? Yes, but. And did anyone check whether the anomaly detection system flagged this as a potential issue? His face went pale. The system didn't alert us to any problems. Because the system requires manual review of flagged anomalies. It's not fully automated, it's designed to work with human oversight. The kind of oversight that comes from understanding Morrison's business patterns and knowing how to interpret the system's alerts. I could see the realization dawning on faces around the office. The system had worked exactly as designed, but the human element, the institutional knowledge Harrison had discarded, was missing. I walked to my desk, opened my laptop, and began typing. Not my resignation, I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Instead, I documented everything. Every email about the access revocation, every conversation about Morrison's data, every warning I'd given about potential system vulnerabilities that had been ignored. I included timestamps, references to specific meetings, and copies of the original code comments where I'd flagged potential issues months ago. The clicking of my keyboard was the only sound in the office. I could feel eyes on me from every cubicle, but I stayed focused on the screen. This wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. About creating a record that couldn't be twisted or forgotten. I pulled up the documentation I'd created the previous week, the one where I'd detailed Morrison's data patterns and potential failure points. I added it to my email, along with a note explaining that I'd created it specifically because I'd anticipated this exact scenario. Then I did something that surprised even me. I included a section analyzing the specific error Harrison had described, explaining exactly why it had happened and how it could have been prevented. I detailed the manual review process that had been skipped, the seasonal data patterns that had been misinterpreted, and the specific alerts that had likely been generated but not properly understood. It took me 45 minutes to write that email, and it was the most important document I'd ever created. Not because it would save my job, by then, I knew I was done with Westside Tech regardless of the outcome. But because it would serve as a blueprint for what not to do, a cautionary tale about the cost of treating institutional knowledge as disposable. 20 minutes later, I hit send on an email to Harrison, Amy, Thomas, and, most importantly, Harrison's manager, Jennifer Walsh. The subject line read, Morrison Project, Documentation of Data Access Issues and Accountability Concerns. The immediate aftermath was electric. I could see Harrison's face drain of color as he read the email on his phone. Within minutes, phones were buzzing throughout the office as people forwarded the message to each other. The invisible network of office gossip had activated, and the story was spreading faster than I'd anticipated. Harrison appeared at my desk again, but this time his aggression was replaced by something closer to fear. His hands were shaking slightly, and there was a thin sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning. Claudia, what did you just send? A timeline, I replied calmly, not looking up from my screen. Documentation of how we got here, who made which decisions, and why the Morrison error was not just predictable but inevitable given the access restrictions. You can't go over my head like this. I finally looked up at him, and for the first time in our entire professional relationship, I saw him clearly. Not as my superior, not as someone whose approval I needed, but as a man who had made poor decisions and was now facing the consequences. I'm not going over your head, I said quietly. I'm creating a record of what happened. If you have a problem with that record, maybe the issue isn't with my documentation, maybe it's with your decisions. My phone buzzed. A text from Jennifer, can you come to my office? Now. As I walked toward the elevator, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years at Westside Tech, complete honesty. No more playing politics, no more accepting blame for other people's decisions, no more pretending that professional courtesy meant swallowing injustice. The weight of constantly managing up, of walking on eggshells around Harrison's fragile ego, of pretending that his decisions made sense, all of it was gone. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like ascending to a different planet. Down in the analytics department, we worked in cramped cubicles with fluorescent lighting and the constant hum of servers. Up here, everything was glass and chrome, with actual windows that showed the city beyond our corporate bubble. Jennifer Walsh's office reflected her personality, organized, professional, but with touches of warmth that made you feel like you were talking to a human being rather than a corporate automaton. She had photos of her family on her desk, books on management theory mixed with novels on her shelves, and plants that were actually thriving. "Claudia, thank you for coming up so quickly," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "I've read your email, and I have to say, I'm deeply concerned about what you've described." The conversation that followed was unlike any I'd ever had with upper management. Jennifer didn't just listen, she asked probing questions, took detailed notes, and demonstrated a level of technical understanding that surprised me. She'd clearly done her homework on the Morrison project and understood the implications of what had happened. "Walk me through the anomaly detection system," she said about 20 minutes into our conversation. "How does it work, and what kind of oversight does it require?" I explained the system's architecture, the machine learning algorithms that identified patterns, and the critical importance of human interpretation. "The system can flag anomalies," I said, "but it can't distinguish between a genuine problem and a false positive. That requires someone who understands Morrison's business cycles, their seasonal patterns, their reporting quirks." "And that someone was you?" "Yes. I spent months learning their patterns, calibrating the system to their specific needs. That knowledge doesn't exist in documentation, it exists in experience." Jennifer nodded slowly. "And Harrison removed your access without ensuring that knowledge was transferred." "Worse than that," I said, feeling the full weight of the situation settle on me. "He removed my access and then blamed me when the system failed because that knowledge was missing. It's like firing the pilot and then blaming them when the plane crashes." The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from the technical details of the Morrison failure to the broader implications of Harrison's management style. Jennifer was thorough, asking for specifics, requesting evidence, and clearly building a case for what would happen next. "I want you to know that this behavior is completely unacceptable," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of genuine authority. "We're implementing new protocols to ensure this kind of scapegoating never happens again. Harrison will be on administrative leave pending a full investigation, and I'm personally going to review all project transitions to ensure proper knowledge transfer." She paused, looking directly at me. "I'm also restoring your access to the Morrison project immediately, along with a formal apology from the company. What happened to you was wrong, and I want to make it right. But here's the thing, I didn't want it anymore. The access, the project, the toxic dynamic that had made this situation possible in the first place. I'd seen behind the curtain, and I couldn't unsee it. The apology felt hollow, the restored access felt like a consolation prize for surviving someone else's manipulation." "I appreciate that, Jennifer," I said carefully. "But I think the damage has already been done. Harrison's actions weren't just about the Morrison project, they were about creating a culture where institutional knowledge is disposable and blame is a management tool." Jennifer's expression shifted, and I could see her processing the broader implications of what I was saying. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that maybe it's time for me to move on. Not because I'm angry, well, not only because I'm angry, but because I've realized that I want to work in an environment where expertise is valued and people are held accountable for their decisions." I gave my notice the next day. 3 weeks later, I'm starting my own consulting firm, specializing in data integrity and system monitoring. My first client? A competitor of Westside Tech who'd heard about my experience and wanted someone who understood the importance of proper oversight. Sometimes being set up to fail is exactly the push you need to stop playing other people's games and start making your own rules. So here's my question for you. Have you ever been blamed for something you couldn't have possibly prevented? How did you handle it? And more importantly, what did it teach you about the people you were working with? I'd love to hear your stories. Because the more we share these experiences, the harder it becomes for people like Harrison to get away with them.